and geographically. Those literary catalogues that are histories of literature, what are they like? It demanded, already knowing the answer. National. Above all, national, sad to say. Now, in a discussion of the qualities appropriate for a national literary history in South Africa, a country where some might see value in the kind of national consolidation that literary histories are often regarded as promoting, one author insisted on, and this is the title of the corresponding article, resisting a national literary history. And I quote, "Nation, literature, and history are each signifiers central to the acts of totalization that the culture of posts has specifically set itself against," he stated, demonstrating in his article his solidarity with the, by implication, non-totalizing culture of posts. I don't want to go into conjectures about the reasons for many Western intellectuals' disquiet about the idea of nation, noting simply that it is a widespread predisposition, not always a helpful one. Julia Kristeva drew no joy from French intellectuals' belief that, as she put it, nationalism is in bad taste and patriotism downright trashy, noting that they thereby leave to the far right the easy privilege of appropriating for itself the wealth of our cultures. And this argument has been made quite recently in Australia in relation to this country and in general by Tim Soutphommasane, who's recently of Monash and is now the Race Discrimination Commissioner in Australia's Human Rights Commission, Reclaiming Patriotism and the Virtuous Citizen, the books in which he makes this argument. And yet, some authors, especially those dealing with national literary histories less well known to Western scholarship and perhaps less in the thrall of Western scholarly conventions, continue to embrace what Perkins identified as the traditional tasks of literary history, recalling the past, including texts seldom read, organizing them by selection and arrangement, interpreting and explaining them by reference to historical context, describing styles and worldviews, describing and also quoting from works deemed significant, and, as he puts it in summary, bringing the past to bear on the present with consequences for the future. And indeed, in this very spirit, a 2003 History of Korean Literature matter-of-factly states that its purpose is to meet the needs of students and general readers who wish to know the main outline of Korean literature. Throughout, we are mindful that this is a narrative history of Korean literature, combining both history and criticism, addressed to the English-speaking reader. And Malcolm Bradbury, in the 2001 Routledge History of Literature in English, concedes that even in times when the world, general and historical and critical ideas, and the canon of literature itself have been undergoing constant deconstruction and reconstruction, sound and intelligent histories of literature still need to be written. There is a tradition still to be remembered, a sequence of forms, myths, preoccupations, cultural debates, literary and artistic trends, great and influential literary movements. My aim today, then, is to recollect a tradition within literary scholarship that has treated literary history as possible and culturally useful. These reflections arise, I must confess, not only out of general interest in this important question about the practice of our discipline, its possibilities and obligations. There is also the particular context of my own wishing to write in English a history of Ukrainian literature, for this is my field. And prior to that, and from some institutional perspectives far more importantly, I also need to write a persuasive ARC application for a grant supporting the preparation of such a book and building on a previous ARC grant to research the role of bilingualism and multilingualism in the literary and non-literary practice of 19th century Ukrainian writers. But beforehand, the issues of the intellectual robustness of such a project, its methodological viability, and its relationship to literary studies in general, Slavic literary studies, Ukrainian literary studies, and Ukrainian literary studies in English, all need to be resolved. Or failing that, to be rhetorically arranged for maximum plausibility, so that most opaque of audiences ARC grant readers. Let me start by reflecting on the polarity or seeming polarity that I have just invoked, the opposition between rigor and rhetoricity. Now, this is a tension that informs the gloom of Wellock and Perkins. Compared to the seeming objectivity of the natural sciences, literary history has too much oratorical arbitrariness about it. It is too transparently wedded to identifiable interests. It is too prone to want to move its addressees, that is, to influence their emotions as well as their minds through the selection and arrangement of its material. From the postmodern perspective, on the other hand, perceiving all discourse as a medium for the flow of power, while entertaining no hopes at all for objectivity, sees literary history, alongside other pursuits of knowledge, as involved in a rhetoric that constantly puts it at risk of being implicated in the unwarranted and deplorable exercise of someone's power over someone else. My point, or rather the point of my agreement with some eminent predecessors, is that such rhetoricity is an inevitable and by no means necessarily insidious dimension of literary history. Indeed, it is an essential feature of the human sciences, and one that enables them to seek to influence the world, whether for the good or what is at some point in time individuals or groups deem to be good, or for the bad. And there is nothing new in this position. Hayden White reminded us forcefully in the 1970s of the figured and troped nature of history writing, and his observations could be extended to writing in all the sciences that deal with people and societies. The whole situation of the humanities is rhetorical. There has been a reluctance to consider historical narratives as what they most manifestly are, verbal fiction. Fictions, I'm sorry, he said. The historical narrative does not reproduce the events it describes. It tells us in what direction to think about the events and charges our thoughts about the events with different emotional valences. And Keith Jenkins, noting that it is impossible to distinguish between history as such and ideological history, made the point that history is never for itself. It is always for someone, and that the predominantly delivered positions will be in the interests of those stronger ruling blocks within social formations. This is a fact that, according to him, imposes the obligation to deconstruct and historicize all those interpretations that have certaintist pretensions. Well, for whom then is literary history written? Whom does it try to reach and persuade? Generally speaking, two somewhat different audiences. The general reader, imagined as a well-informed person seeking to gain the kinds of insight and information from a history of literature that Perkins outlined, the undergraduate student, for example, and the author's peers, specialists, able to judge both the factual reliability and the methodological and theoretical credulity of the work. For whom, however, also means for whose benefit, which is why Jenkins warns against histories that, I quote, fail to call into question the conditions of their own making, which forget to indicate their subservience to unrevealed interests, and which mask those epistemological, methodological, and ideological presuppositions that mediate the past into history, unquote. For Jenkins, The rhetoricity of history does not invalidate it as an intellectual pursuit. It does, however, impose on author and reader alike an obligation to be sensitive to the rhetorical situation. That is to say, to be clear about who is speaking and on whose behalf, which audience the orator is trying to persuade, and what devices are deployed for this purpose. Now, in his Topica, writing about ways of persuasion, Aristotle suggests, I'm sorry, I don't have a recent photo of Aristotle, that appeals to common sense and to learned authority actually have equal standing. Those opinions, he says, are generally accepted, which are accepted by everyone or the majority, or by the philosophers, that is, by all, or by the majority, or by the most notable and illustrious of them. Now, I shall return to the philosophers, who may be taken as addressees of literary history, in a moment. As for the majority, we may take it that these are readers whom publishers, whether intuitively or on the basis of market research, believe to exist, and whose needs, worldviews, and shared experience such books as Histories of Literature must therefore take into account. Today, the members of this majority may no longer need literary histories as ready reference books, where they can look up names, dates, and titles of works. This function has been taken over by web search engines. But they may want to make sense of literature in the light of their pre-existent knowledge and experience. And an important object of their pre-existing knowledge and experience, whatever part of the world they live in, is the nation state. Discussions widespread during the 1990s concerning the end, or at least the growing irrelevance, of the nation state notwithstanding, it continues to be the case that nation states are the building blocks of the geopolitical edifice. They are among the most universal fruits of modernity. Since 1991, their number has continued to increase. Almost every person on the planet comes within the legal ambit of at least one of them. We have daily evidence of their capacity to become foci of collectively experienced emotions, positive as well as negative. Some nation states, especially those in Europe, came into being as embodiments of the visions of elites that put themselves in charge of groups of people who were ready to see themselves as nations. Others, especially states created in the process of decolonization, are building new nations that will correspond to them. The question of the constructiveness of nations, so influentially discussed by Benedict Anderson, a generous point being made, need not concern us here. Important for this discussion, however, is the fact that nations change, as do the worldviews, value systems, myths, and emotions that their members associate with them. Some of these views and values are held in common by many, many members of the one nation. Others are specific to particular communities within it. These national moods and predispositions change in response to various factors: cultural shifts, global and local, changing economic circumstances and thus life experiences, and directed endeavors, especially by governments, through education or propaganda. And the direction of these shifts is important. It sets parameters for action by citizens and groups within the nation state and by representatives of the nation state on the international arena. It is more than reasonable, therefore, to regard every input that influences the ethical culture of the nation state as important, which is why certain debates about national identity and its tributary national history periodically reach a level of warmth, justifying the labeling of them as culture wars. The content and tone of histories of national literatures is thus an issue of practical importance, at least for Aristotle's majority. It makes a difference what kind of story the narrator of a national history of literature tells. A 19th century epic tale of the heroic development through masterly works crystallizing the national genius of an ethno-linguistically unitary national spirit from profoundly ancient times to a triumphant present, or a narrative of many strands that pays attention to the presence within a national literature of textual expressions of various identity groups differentiated by ethnos, language, social status or gender, reflecting the while on what at various historical moments nation and national literature might mean. Many discussions of literature in new nations arising from former colonies take the participation of a national literature in nation building as axiomatic. They debate not the possibility of a national literature, but the shape that it and its history should take. And the problems are not trivial, as discussions apropos of particular African national literatures manifest. What, for example, should be included in Nigerian national literature and its history? All oral and written outputs in all of the languages spoken in that nation state? Or writings in a selection of those languages? Or only writings in the language of the former colonial power, English? Each of these variants, of course, is imbued with different political messages and corresponds to different interests. Literary historiography thus is, or has the potential to be, one of the many cultural interventions that help shape each nation. It has been, and continues potentially to be, a medium for proposing understandings of pasts conceived of as national, and therefore a means of influencing national futures. At this point I want to make an amplification and a digression. The amplification is that this generalization concerning the potentially activist role of literary history holds true whether the voice or voices of a literary history come from within a national culture or from outside of it. In the latter case, it has a double addressee. The English language New History of German Literature of 2004, for example, explicitly names as its target audience readers almost anywhere. But de facto, one presumes, readers literate in English. Implicitly, it also speaks to an imaginary German audience, challenging it with the judgments that a largely United States authorship offers an international audience apropos of things, mainly but not exclusively texts, German. In 2007, this virtual audience turned into a real one with the publication of the German translation of this literary history. My digression sounds a note of caution about the idea that any national literary history today, once it reflects on its theoretical underpinnings, must necessarily adopt a position that is, if not epistemologically skeptical, at least pluricentric. Elsewhere than in the West, favorable attitudes towards grand narratives of national literary history are not so rare. Take the following intervention from Estonia, published in 1991, and composed, no doubt, in the closing moments of the USSR. And its emphatic cultural essentialism needs to be read as a manifesto of liberty from the Russocentrism of the Soviet Union that had been masked as socialist internationalism. I quote, "Our starting point is the claim that any national literature is a system characterized by the following features: an organic connection to the historical destiny," you can put quotation marks throughout this passage, an organic connection to the historical destiny of its ethnic group, a national language as the basic medium of its existence, rootedness in the folklore and mythology of its ethnic group, stability and dynamism as an aesthetic system, the existence of an indigenous, self-aware artistic tradition interacting with other national art forms, social and aesthetic heterogeneity, a literary development and growth influenced by, or generically and typologically correlated with, other literatures and the world literary process. Every national literature is characterized by a specific combination of these features which distinctly define a national literary and aesthetic system. From this point of view, there exist such things as national artistic consciousness, the presence of the national point of view, or a national way of seeing things. Now, one would not only question the exclusivist, because radically anti-colonial values invoked here, one would also need to point out that the general definition of national literature often simply does not accommodate the many national literatures that emerged from the breakup of other colonial empires than the Soviet one. Nevertheless, we should take this passage as a vivid illustration of the point that, in some places, the long 19th century is longer than we think. Now, the perhaps self-evident observation that the humanities, history, and literary history are not insignificant sites of political activism has been made often, and by radical and transformative voices. Speaking of her 1977 book, A Literature of Their Own, British women novelists from Bronte to Lessing, Elaine Showalter formulated the gist of its feminist intervention in the public sphere as the conferral upon women of the presence that is attested by historical narrative. I knew that I wanted to give women a history, a literary history. I wanted to give them back their place in history. It was not an antiquarian quest, it was not a traditional scholarly adventure, but I knew women would read it, and it would be a way to see that we had a history, we had a tradition, we had a literature. Allow me now to illustrate this argumentative quality, this interventionist, activist, project quality of national literary histories, even when they make no overt political claims. I shall refer to a text well known to me, Dmytro Czyżewski's History of Ukrainian Literature, and its afterlife in the form of polemical responses and re-editions. Czyżewski, whose dates were 1894 to 1977, possibly the most preeminent post-war Slavist, comparative Slavist, was born in the Ukrainian lands of the Russian Empire, trained in philosophy and philology at St. Petersburg and Kiev, then studied under Edmund Husserl at Freiburg. In Prague between 1924 and 1932, he was a member of the Prague Linguistic Circle. He then taught at Halle and Marburg in Germany. After a stint at Harvard in 1951 to 56, he returned to Germany to the University of Heidelberg. 1956 was the year of the publication in New York, in Ukrainian, of his history. Not a conventional national literary history by any account. Reflecting Czyżewski's affinity for formalist approaches to the study of literature, it privileged poetry and focused on trope, figure, and prosody. Czyżewski was opposed both to the economic base and cultural superstructure model that was compulsory for literary scholarship in the Soviet Union, and to the heroic populist national narrative that dominated émigré Ukrainian discourse. He saw his subject as a history of styles, which for him were expressed in worldviews as much as in the form of works of art. The pattern of his history was a kind of eternal dialectical oscillation between opposed stylistic principles. Renaissance, then Baroque, then Classicism, then Romanticism, then Realism, then Modernism. In addition to the explicit historical thesis of this history and its subtextual argument against both the Soviet and the émigré mainstreams, it also implicitly added its voice to those of figures like Erich Auerbach and Ernst Robert Curtius, who offered European master narratives of literary history as post-war alternatives to their national or nationalist predecessors. Chizhevsky insisted that there was a single history of European literature and that European literature was part of it. And later he would make the same argument about Slavic literatures in general. It would appear that Chizhevsky's scheme of Ukrainian literary history did not pass unnoticed in Soviet Ukraine, where the 8-volume History of Ukrainian Literature, which came out in 1967 to 71, as one of the delayed fruits of the post-Stalin thaw, silently acknowledged and discreetly echoed his emphasis on style, periodization, and the interconnectedness, the national interconnectedness, or international interconnectedness of the literary process. It would take more time than I have to discuss the complex interaction of official and not so official arguments in this Soviet history. On the surface, it intoned all of the obligatory historical topoi, the class basis of history, the division of the literary field into progressive and reactionary domains, the unshakable friendship of the Soviet peoples and their irrepressible yearning throughout their history for union with the Russian people. Just below the surface, it made arguments about the antiquity, dignity, wealth, and distinctiveness of Ukrainian literature, nourishing a subterranean national narrative within mainstream Soviet culture that, some would later argue helped account for the ease with which Soviet elites adopted national positions on the eve of the collapse of the USSR. In 1975, Chizhevsky's history appeared in translation into English, once more in the United States, under the editorship of the University of Toronto professor George S.N. Lutsky. And the new edition had a new rhetorical objective. Its appearance coincided with a concerted effort by Ukrainian emigre communities in the United States and Canada, and shortly afterwards Australia, to establish university programs and chairs of Ukrainian studies, in part because of the prestige connected with such institutions, in part in the hope of countering the Russocentrism of Slavic and Soviet studies in the West. The new university programs required a certain critical mass of foundation texts in English, and Lutsky contributed energetically to their production. Chizhevsky's history was thus recycled as an introductory text and students' reference work. A role that, given its theoretical bent and the clearly subjective nature of some of its emphases, it did not quite fit. Nonetheless, in the absence of a competitor, it served so well that in the 1990s the publisher approached Lutsky for a second edition, but augmented with new material, bringing the narrative up to the present. In the end, what was published in 1997 was a volume encompassing under the one cover Chizhevsky's history and Lutsky's own Ukrainian literature in the 20th century, A Reader's Guide, a text of utterly different, indeed traditionalist and commonsensical theoretical presuppositions. What Georgy Lukács, had he lived, would perhaps have called a triumph of postmodernism, Ukrainian literary studies were suddenly enriched, faute de mieux, but very much in keeping with the zeitgeist, with a literary history embodying the denial of monolithic, systematic, essentializing, and certainly coherent narrative. Meanwhile, back in the real world, somewhat more deliberate quests for alternatives to traditional national literary histories had resulted in publications that set out to foreground through their very structure their intent to deconstruct the traditional literary historical account. The first and most discussed of these was Harvard University Press's New History of French Literature, 1989, followed 15 years later by its compositionally almost identical New History of German Literature. And here you can see immediately that German literature pales beside its French counterpart. Now, in both the principles of chronology were applied in a way that underscores the editor's refusal of linear narrative. Instead, the histories resurrected from late antiquity the genre of the chronicle. Under particular years, members of gigantic authors' collectives, 165 contributors to the French history, 152 to the German, including one Australian, that's Monash's David Roberts, he's seated right here. I have a choice between the real and the virtual information. Consider texts or events from the perspective of their own convictions, interests and methods, with no overt harmonization with respect to theory. Of course, the overall projects themselves and the great majority of contributions evince their sympathy for post-structuralist indeterminacy. The German history announces its vision of every literary text, whenever composed, as contemporary with us, that is, on account of its present availability to the reader, and thus professes its intention of preserving the quality of encounter that characterizes the most exhilarating experiences of reading. Both histories claim to address the general reader. In the German instance, the general educated reader. What's in a stereotype? Reviewers, however, and especially satirically inclined British ones, were not slow to point out that these new histories, in fact, presuppose readers already familiar with the plot and characters set forth in the old histories, and are in fact directed to literary scholars, Aristotle's philosophers, if you like. Their central argument being to demonstrate the possibility of non-traditional ways of doing national literary history. One could add that these new histories, while resisting grand narratives, do not fail to make a number of grand statements. They proclaim the dominance of French theory in the foreign language departments of United States universities, and thus argue that these departments are not retrograde relative to their counterparts in English and or comparative literature. The authorship being overwhelmingly drawn from American academia, they offer the European home counterparts of their disciplines an object lesson in the theoretical progressiveness of United States scholarship. Through the rhetorical device of the list of contributors, they showcase, for an audience of intending graduate students perhaps, the preeminence in their respective fields of certain elite United States institutions, Yale and the University of Pennsylvania in French, Harvard, Columbia, and Stanford in German. Finally, of course, they are outward and visible signs of the sacramental status of Harvard University Press itself. Now, another major experiment in literary historiography was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the so-called SSHRC, and Toronto University in 1996-2001. Its first product was the 3-volume Literary Cultures of Latin America, a comparative history, manifestly not a national history, and one whose very title declines to name literature as its privileged object of inquiry, preferring the broader and at the same time less determinate literary cultures. The plural emphasizing the project's programmatic centrifugality. The history in question is conceptualized as taking place above nations. Not that these are rejected as relevant concepts, but readers are invited to contemplate the existence alongside them of other groupings and identities, and cultural centers take the place of nations as the main actors in this history. Our response to Foucault's challenge, the preface states, is to establish the diversity of speaking voices in Latin America. In a gesture dismissive of the very idea of unfolding narrative, users of comparative history are urged to start reading anywhere, since totalizing narrative has been deconstructed and the conventions of writing effective history have come down to good writing. They don't define what good writing might be. Equally committed to generic innovation was the other part of the SSHRC project, the history of the literary cultures of East Central Europe. This went so far in its aversion to conventional narrative as to invert chronology, to contradict the conventional metaphors of development and of origin, and to underscore the present as the subject's cognitive point of departure. The history starts by considering a cluster of events, texts, and other phenomena connected to 1989. Then works backwards through 1956, 1948, 1918, and so on, reaching the end of history, so to speak, in the twinned dates 1776 and 1789, neither of which is connected with East or Central Europe, at least not directly, which is one of the points being made. Accounts of literary and other events are organized around places, generally cities, where the cultures of various ethnic groups and or nation exist in parallel or in dialogue with one another. The history seeks to establish the analytical value of a notion of four cultural nodes. First, the temporal, comprising watershed dates. Then the institutional, which encompasses social structures that become the means of organizing literary culture. Then the topographical, locations that become the centrifugal disseminators of their imaginary world and at the same time function as centripetal centers of attraction, drawing writers, poets, publishers, and artists into their orbit. And finally, the figural, strangely indistinct, but embracing historical and imaginary subjects, but also stereotypes, texts, and personified objects of great variety that galvanize ideas attracted to a basic image, or in broader terms, to a socio-cultural symbol. That's a quotation. For all of its structural pyrotechnics, this history failed to address the political issue of national sensitivities, especially to attend to the key post-colonial value of visibility for the recently subaltern. Instead, it reproduced rather traditional and disappointingly discriminatory views of the relative importance of cultures, reifying a hierarchy whose pedigree goes back to the dubious distinction between historical and non-historical nations. This blindness in pursuit of insight was reflected in something as simple as the amount of space afforded the phenomena of various national literatures. I would challenge you to find anything about Belarusian literature in this text. Whatever the individual merits and demerits of these examples of new literary histories may be, they demonstrate by their very existence that the assertion of the impossibility of intellectually grounded histories is rather a modesty topos suitable for the initial pages of literary history before they get down to business, than it is a statement about a real and a methodological debility. Literary histories are not merely possible, they are possible in a variety of forms, corresponding to a variety of theoretical starting points. I can only agree with the editors of the History of the Literary Cultures of East Central Europe when they say the crucial question is not whether literary histories based on consensus are possible, but whether a history can be instrumental in moving a transnational public towards morally and politically desirable consensus. Good literary and other histories recontextualize known information and explanations from the perspective of the present and a vision of the future. Now, my sole modification of this statement would be, in the light of my discussion of the continued vitality of the nation state as a framework for a great deal of human collective consciousness, experience, and action, to add the words "and national" to transnational. I would like to draw towards the close by considering two arguments. One, an especially powerful, to my mind, example of an assertion of the ethical potential of literary history. The other, an early intervention in the debate on literary history that set out very clearly why skepticism about its possibility was misplaced. The first is Linda Hutchin's defense of histories of post-colonial literatures as testimonial records of the trauma of empire. Hutchin, one of the initiators of the Canadian Literary Histories project, confronts the question of why it is that when, quote, postmodern and post-structuralist theory has begun to dismantle the ideology that subtends teleological narratives, not all constituencies have welcomed this dismantling, unquote. One reason, she submits, is the utility of such narratives for projects of decolonization. They engage in a canny borrowing of the structural power of that earlier nationalist narrative of a history of progress, using it to new but equally political interventionist ends. Hutchin approves of post-colonial literary history's capacity to see a nation's literature from the perspective of its imperial legacy, exposing its inevitably traumatic and likely repressed narratives. Such acts of witnessing, she says, constitute an ethical as well as political project, literary history as testimonial. This, Hutchin contrasts to other earlier national identity narratives grounded in remembered moments of heroism and glory. And in the contrast, of course, there is an implicit evaluation. Testimonio, legitimate. Heroism and glory, not so. And yet, between these two modes of making sense of the literary past, the post-colonial and the national, there is a difference defined not by different epistemologies, but by different political values that inform the literary historian's inquiries. It is simply part of the predicament of literary history writing that, through choice of period, selection of material, positioning of narrative voice, it inevitably mirrors the stance of the writer. This is not a discovery, but the axiom of a hermeneutic approach to understanding the human world of the past, as Hans-Georg Gadamer made clear. The historicity of our existence entails that prejudice, prejudice. That prejudice, in the literal sense of the word, constitutes the initial directiveness of our whole ability to experience. Prejudices are biases of our openness to the world. They are simply conditions whereby we experience something, whereby what we encounter says something to us. And this was a point made here at Monash by Walter Veit in a number of essays in the 1980s. In direct response to Wellek, and well before Wellek's skepticism about literary history was raised to a higher power by post-structuralist doubt, Veit articulated epistemological reassurances about literary history that were based on the hermeneutic perspective. For Veit, certainty or causal explanation or the production of a simple, single, true narrative were not the domain of the humanities. The aim of literary historiography, Veit argued, in step with Gadamer, was the production of meaning, something that could take place only through the interaction of the past, known to us only through the medium of previous interpretations, and our own cognitive interests and questions. As he put it, the work and its world are understood only if and as far as the critic's own world is clarified at the same time in the same process. Embracing this ineluctable mutual hermeneutic involvement of the object of the inquiry and the historian's own perspective, which inevitably is informed or guided, prejudiced by his or her own values and conditioned by his or her own circumstances. Veit, writing in the journal New Literary History in 2008, called for a reassessment of literary historical tasks in the light of globalization. Among the general tasks he identified was that of describing the relationship between existing national literatures and an emerging global literature. Among the tasks specific to Australian literary historiography, he named the inscription into the national literary history of the writings of authors belonging to cultural minorities or writing in languages other than English. In fact, the major Australian literary histories of the last 2.5 decades, the Penguin New Literary History of Australia, 1988, the Oxford Literary History of Australia, 1998, which was co-edited by Bruce Bennett and Monash's Jenny Strauss, and the Cambridge History of Australian Literature, 2009, they do indeed rise to this mission. Without foregrounding the theoretical underpinnings of such structures, they reflect the fact that a non-unitary vision for discussion of the Australian literary field is now mainstream. They attend to the presence of parallel cultural identities, indigenous or settler, gendered, immigrant, within or not within an overarching national culture. They recognize the relevance of regional and global contexts for conversation about Australian literature, as, for example, Robin Dursto's chapter Representations of Asia does in the Cambridge History. So finally, why would I want to write a history of Ukrainian literature? Well, the reasons that could be put in an ARC application should be clear enough from what I've said hitherto. I'd like to write a history from an inclusive, multicultural, multilingual perspective, one that would include not just the Polish and the Russian interactions, which have commonly been part of Ukrainian literary histories, but the Crimean Tatar, the Yiddish, the German. The list could be extended. I'd also like to write this history as a post-colonial one that would give attention to the flows of power of empire through the institutions, conventions, canons, and hierarchies of this literary sphere. And then there are additional, equally compelling reasons inexpressible in an ARC application, but ones that in a semi-confessional context like this Writers and Their World seminar series one might admit to. The desire to end the extraordinary situation where the only extant English language history of Ukrainian literature is a curious re-edition of Chizhevsky's 60-year-old text. The desire to say my piece on a number of disciplinary debates within a longer systematic statement rather than in individual articles and reviews. Then there is the anti-colonial ressentiment that gnaws at the entrails of every Ukrainianist worth her or his salt. We all want to combat the injustice of invisibility to the big world with which Ukrainian culture has so long been afflicted. Finally, there is a fair dose of post-colonial utopianism, a wish to promote in Ukraine, however indirectly, the idea of a culturally fair, inclusive society, and to give an account of the cultural record of colonial abuses of power without engaging in forward-projected rancor. How might this new history of Ukrainian literature look? Having described it, I realize that it would look rather Australian. Perhaps that's what I should call it. An Australian history of Ukrainian literature.
Quite a lot of time for questions. I'm sure there are many. Please feel free.
I thought the answer why you would want to write national literary histories is because you're in a post-colonial culture. Essentially, that's very handy because I'm not really terribly excited by the idea of national literary history, and I then ask myself, why would I not want to write national literary history? And the answer is because I'm British. But that would party to the most triumphal exaggeration in the world. Exactly. And that takes me back. First of all, the general defense of literary history, I think, is absolutely sound, absolutely right. But it also seems that going back to the immediate post-war transition from re-translation of comparative literature, it's clear that has much to do, clearly in Albart's case, but in elsewhere too, with a response to those dominant national narratives, above all in Germany, but actually in Britain and France, and other European great powers, where they're led. And I'm really, that's really a reminder that I would wish to make, that the politics cuts clearly both ways. And whilst one might want to write postcolonial national literature, here you do, but we also want to be cautious about what the over importance, exaggeration of the role of the nation, the way it too imposes limitations on literary history, especially as those old imperial national literary histories, that still it worries me enormously. And that's not just the politics. I am genuinely bothered by this. But actually, I can tell you a little story. I was paid by the Dard and the Goethe Institute to speak at a conference where he was supposed to be speaking. It was in his honour that he didn't come. This at the University of Zagreb. And it was a paper I was giving on comparative literature. And it's always nice to be paid in the case for comparative literature. But I realised in the process of this conference that all the people from the Goethe Institute were actually involved in this, essentially because they were utterly alarmed about the scale of Croatian, the importance of the Croatian literature was occupied in the university's curriculum. And it was in fact, we were being paid in a way, you notice this, come to the conference, to argue against Croatian literary nationalism, which is of course a postcolonial literary nationalism. And indeed Croatia is a former part of the German-speaking Austrian Empire, and go on. So I do see the way this cuts both ways, but it seems to me that the problem is, indeed, it does cut both ways. And that if one starts from the point which much literary study does after all, what sense do you make of particular authors in particular times and places, then what still strikes me most forcefully is how limiting a national perspective can be. That it is so important to recognise the relationship between British writers, English writers, and the classical Greek and Roman literary heritage which is shared across the whole of the continent. And it's so important to recognise the way in which Don Quixote influences all European national literatures, or nearly most of the ones I'm familiar with anyway. And those sort of counter things. I mean, it's not I don't think you have to make a choice. Clearly you do when you write this particular book. But literary studies clearly has to recognise both that the nation state is extremely important, but that it hasn't always been so, that it wasn't in medieval Europe, and that it is threatened, as Walter pointed out in her essay, challenged by globalisation and by publishing industries that are increasingly globalised as well. And so it's not that I disagree with you, it's just that it seems to me one also might want to write non-national literary histories.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, my point is certainly not directed against comparative literary histories or literary histories conceived of in non-totalizing ways, but rather it is to offer an argument why national literary history written from a perspective that we would recognize as ethically defensible is a worthwhile proposition. I mean, it is the argument made by Kristeva is a good one, I think. If the left doesn't speak about nations at all because it doesn't like the idea, and no consideration of the nation is given from a perspective that is pluricentric, that is tolerant, that is liberal, what you will get will be monolithic, violent, aggressive nationalist histories or perspectives upon the nation. So, I mean, it seems to me that it's not only legitimate, but it's also necessary, as it were, to stake out this territory as a legitimate territory for the investigation from other perspectives than monological and inevitably power-driven. But I agree with you entirely, and it cuts both ways, and that is the reason why I find so important those qualifications that Hayden White and Keith Jenkins put. It is the obligation of every historical writing that takes itself and its readership and its obligations to the public seriously to make clear what it is actually doing when it speaks.
Could I continue with this, because it's such a fascinating topic. In a certain sense, can we even speak of the Ukraine as a nation state? Has it actually got there yet? And isn't in a certain way the question on the possibility and the impossibility of writing a national history of Ukrainian literature, which would then extend to most of Eastern Europe, wouldn't it? As they were enclosed in empires and so on. So I think the hypothetical, I don't disagree with your reasons for writing it or anything like that. And I understand that if you're in a situation where Ukraine is still struggling to decide what its identity is, some kind of intervention in the form of a national history of literature can be significant. But also the question has to be raised, isn't it a hypothetical question, or in a certain way, can a literary history be written? It's possible and impossible at the same time.
Well, I think it is possible on a scale of from 1 to 10, where 1 is impossible and 10 is impossible. I would put it at about 2, closer to possible than impossible. And Ukraine is precisely the kind of situation where questions of interventions in the public sphere on issues of identity are critical.
Yeah.
It is, and this point has been made in previous literary histories. I'll stand, perhaps it's easier to be heard if I stand. The incomplete literary history for an incomplete nation, that was a trope that was used by Chizhevsky. Chizhevsky referred to Ukraine as an incomplete nation, meaning exactly what you mean. It was a nation which hadn't, at that stage, and was far from having a nation state of its own. And so any writing about such a topic would necessarily have a kind of a utopian or a project quality to it. And there's a very, very interesting debate between the then dead Chizhevsky and George Grabovich, the professor of Ukrainian history, Ukrainian literature at Harvard, who held the Chizhevsky chair, by the way. And he totally disagreed with Chizhevsky, claiming that incompleteness is a priori, a kind of everything, because it is a given, is already complete. It exists in the real world as it exists. So that was his response, if you like, to 30 years ago to the question that you're putting. And the question never went away, because it is, of course, continually a kind of a real question. In Ukraine today, which is a country which reflects a great deal on its multiple identities, and where there is a constant debate about what the kind of future Ukrainian nation as a kind of civic nation should be like, and what its cultural features should be. And there is a rightist position, and there's a kind of an indifferentist position. There isn't really a kind of a a leftist position that argues from the positions that we would recognise as familiar and desirable. And this is what I would like to do, to inject into this debate this Australian pattern, if you like, of multi-strandedness, multiculturalism, respect for all available cultures, the recognition of these suppressed narratives, because that point is not being made in any part of the literary debate.
Yes, Rita. So just on that point, I'm really interested in this idea of whether one can only write national literary histories in English, which is what you're planning to do, Marko, from outside of the national territory. I don't know what to call it. So that's the first question.
Okay.
And it's obvious, I think we're skirting around.
I did want to extend my discussion of outside and inside, but there was only time to name it here. There is no real outside or inside for anybody in the world today, because we're all, in a way, involved in everyone else's culture. And for a person like myself, who for 30 years has been working on Ukrainian literature, it's impossible, in fact, for me to think of myself as an outsider. I merely use this as a kind of a convenient standpoint when I go to Ukraine and want to say something that will be listened to. the automatic authority of the outsider. But yes, obviously this will be written from within, not from outside any positions, but in particular from within two positions. One is a position of, I suppose, well, you know how it is when one feels a particular affinity with a particular identity group. The main symptom of this is cringing whenever it does something that you disapprove of. So I suffer this cringe, as it were, on behalf of Australia, and I suffer it also on behalf of Ukraine. And I want to inscribe this cringe into the literary history.
So just a quick follow-up on that. That's exactly the way I was thinking. I was thinking it's very difficult to define, and this I would think is an effect of, the globalization, nation-state, transnational discussion. It's very difficult to be inside or outside, even if, regardless of one's political view, I think. But the other thing completely sympathize with the cringe. I have to bear the cringe of Berlusconi, whether I like it or not. So completely sympathize. The other thing that struck me as interesting when you were talking is that the new literary history of Germany was first written in English by United States scholars and then translated into German. So there's the question of, apart from this is an interesting power flow, if you like, or perspective, the question of audience, again, becomes very important. And the fact that you're writing it in English, for me, presupposes you're imagining an audience that is a very international, I don't know what to call it, a very non-Ukrainian speaking audience, maybe. And that would have then a very different effect and influence, rather than if you were writing it. You could write exactly the same thing, I know you could, in Ukrainian, but you choose not to.
Well, I probably will auto-translate it.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. That's the next step. Yes. Then you'll write the PhD on self-translation.
Yeah, and then the psychoanalysis.
And then the
well, the reason for writing it in English in the first instance is that that's good. that is a way of adding a sort of a distancing layer, and it also imposes the discipline of needing to explain everything that you want to have understood quite clearly, so that you have before your mind the image of an audience that is culturally variegated and Anglo-literate, which is quite a lot of the people that one wants to reach in any case, including nowadays the colleagues in Eastern Europe who are if they're under 40 in general, are as much conversant with English as their colleagues across the border in Poland or the Czech Republic. Perhaps not quite as much as in Germany. So, so it's that technical question of it being easier to write. Then there's, of course, the fact that if I wrote it in Ukrainian and put it in the research publications report, I'd have to prove that the publishing house is in fact a commercial publisher, which is an academic press. You try to prove that about any East European press. But no, your real question is, how do you see your audience? Well, I see it actually as a bifurcated, as one audience which is bifurcated, perhaps temporarily bifurcated. Once one has written it, then a little time later there will be the readers in the other language. And I'm sure that, I don't know this, one would need to read the reviews, but I'm sure that the way that the Harvard New German Literary History must have spoken to German readers or people in Germany reading it now as a text in German, was that it would have encouraged them to ask themselves, how are these canonical qualities of our German culture perceived, understood, and used by people outside? What kind of chains of thought do they excite in the English-speaking world? Is this of relevance to us in Germany? What can we make of the way we are viewed from outside? So that is the real answer that I want to give to your question.
Thank you.
I think you're taking your own question.
I heard you speaking about Yiddish or Jewish influences in the Ukrainian literature. That really attracts my attention, because some of the most important Yiddish writers were living in either Lithuania or the Ukraine. And my question is, are their works translated and now in the Ukraine, translated into Ukrainian and now into the Ukrainian public?
Scarcely at all, I think, would be the answer. There are a number of writers who make a point of their Jewish identity, who write in Ukrainian or in Russian, and who publish and are well known and well respected. There are also some emigres living in Israel who used to write in Ukrainian and continue to write in Ukrainian. They obviously, in a very obvious way, belong. But what I mean is that there is a whole tradition of writing which was not integrated, as far as I can see, into any kind of mainstream or even important minority context, and which is practically unknown. But rather like, writing by Greek Australian writers for the Greek Australian and Greek diaspora and Greek homeland community, unless they've been translated into English. Now, from my perspective, these belong in the narrative of Australian literature. And in the same way, it seems to me that the writings of Yiddish authors belong in a proper history of Ukrainian literature. The most famous, of course, person of famous Jewish writer who was born in Ukraine was Paul Celan, of course, who is not thought of as a Ukrainian writer in any sense, of course. So, I mean, the question of how do you write about the Jewish Russian language writers of Odessa in a Ukrainian literary history is an interesting one. Quite often these were people who not only didn't have a relationship to the Ukrainian literary process, but were often quite skeptical about it and disliked it, preferring to identify themselves if anything, with the all-imperial literary process. But the answer, it seems to me, to finding where they belong in the literary historical narrative is not to ignore them, but to say who they were and what they did.
Thank you.
Well, I was actually going to ask not that question, but the question I think you answered in the answer, which was about where will you put the diasporic Ukrainian writers? Are you going to include them in your national history, which I think you've already answered, but you might want to say something more about that. And also the question of writers' own self-identification, which I think is becoming increasingly complex. I think it's increasing, as you already talked about your own double cringe identity. You know, this hyphenated identities can go into 2, 3, 4 kind of hyphens. So, you know, I wonder whether there's any sense of the writer's own self-identification, national identification, as playing any role in what you will be including or excluding.
Yeah, well, on the issue of diaspora, it is clearly of critical importance. There are some literatures in which diaspora writing is really very important. I mean, in the German instance, during the Second World War, where the mainstream, if you like, of German literary history is thought by many to continue. The same is true of Russian literary history, with figures like Nabokov, a very interesting multi-identity writer, splitting his identity 3 ways. And then, of course, in the Ukrainian literary sphere, the role of Prague in the 1920s is absolutely crucial to any account of the history. Then the extraordinary writing and literary debates that happened in the displaced persons camps in West Germany in the second half of the 40s, and then in the late 50s and early 60s, the role of the New York group of Ukrainian poets, who are kind of a modernist group, conceiving itself very much in terms of like the Beat generation of American writers, poets. So this clearly, you can't write a proper history of Ukrainian literature without paying due attention to this. The question of the self-identity of these authors is clearly an issue. Now, it seems, and it's part of a bigger question. I mean, what is the role of biography in a national literary history, or indeed in any literary history? Is it purely a history of texts, or is it a combined history of people and texts? And my sense is, and this is a kind of just a private kind of view, is that from a common sense perspective, the kinds of stories we expect of national literary histories don't exclude the person as one of the foci. I mean, we can focus on groups, we can focus on texts, but if we don't focus on people as individuals, then we're missing out part of that narrative that hermeneutically is so important to us. So it seems to me that the question of how does a particular writer identify him or herself is a very important part of the biography of any writer. I mean, we were at a seminar recently where Ali Alizadeh explained to us quite how he sees his own identity, and I cannot see that one would exclude this particular self-interpretation from a proper account of what Ali does as a poet.
Well, just very quickly, histories of the book, which over the last 30 years have been written largely national frameworks, pose similar problems. I'm not going to get into them now. I should probably come and talk to you about it sometime. When Volume 1 of the History of the Book in Australia was finished, which I hope will happen in a year or so. But there are all sorts of problems that are in parallel to the ones that you encounter in writing national literary histories.
Yeah. And indeed, in the early histories of Australian literature, these problems, the bibliographical problems, loomed quite large. I was rather interested to have a look at Green's, the preface to Green's history, which is not called a history, it has some other title, of Australian literature, which focuses on that very question of selection. How much Australianness must there be in an author for him to be included? And there's quite a subtle discussion of this, which we can't reproduce. I mean, these questions are always infinitely complex and will necessarily have to be simplified in any real practical text.
Does Helen Demidenko? Famous Australian writer.
The linchpin of Australian Ukrainian
I was actually on the same trail as that your question said, in the sense of where the subject of Ukraine versus the nationality of the writers of Ukrainian literature is a determinant factor in how you're going to select material. Now, because obviously you've just quoted the Australian examples of that, which is very real. Australian nationalism has played out in our literature very obviously, and is becoming now very questionable, questioned these days. But in a place where I've also been living for the last decade, a place like Singapore, which is yet another smaller, a small and younger literary culture in English, which is quickly trying to use its kind of money position to create a national literature through grants and through, throwing money at the whole issue. And in fact, subtly determining the way that they want to create a certain brand name in literary sense. So, in fact, I know for a fact that if you go for a literary grant in Singapore, if you don't mention Singapore, if you don't have a Singaporean subject, then you're unlikely to get a grant. If you do mention it, you will get a grant. So I'm just, I'm wondering about subject versus identity of the writer, because that was also an important question to see.
But your question, of course, relates the question of the identity of the writer to the self-identity of the nation state, which within the confines of which the writer lives. Many writers try to see themselves as not really within nation state confines. But I mean, the point has been made in post-colonial literary studies, particularly in reference to Africa, where the nation states are culturally so amorphous, or not amorphous, but so diffuse. And each of these states has a ministry of culture, and each of these ministries of culture has a policy. And having a policy on the national literature means supporting certain directions of its development and not others. So the nation state is intimately involved in such circumstances. It's less obvious, perhaps, in a culture like ours, where literary production runs itself more or less, and it's part of market relations. But in a place like Singapore and in a place like Ukraine, the presence of a sophisticated national cultural policy is very important. I mean, Ukrainian intellectuals have been bemoaning the fact that Ukraine either has no cultural policy or a pro-Russian one as a state, which is yet another. That is, of course, yet another kind of rhetorical flourish which one could deconstruct.
Oh, but stop me if you've answered this already, because I have to slip out there. But I just wondered whether you feel that, I mean, if you see two of the many poles sort of pull you apart on a literary history are your own, so to speak, are your,
This is a very sensitive
one of them is the hermeneutic narrative, and the other one is the encyclopedia. Do you feel that the presence of the internet, the fact that facticity is, of varying degrees of authority is available, has relieved you from the problems of writing a literary history?
Yes, look, I think so. I mean, it's quite clear if one reads the reviews of some of the important literary histories of the print age, that what the reviewers are concerned about is factual accuracy. That's one thing they're concerned about. The other thing is proper balance, right? I mean, is writer A given sufficient space, or is the importance of writer B inflated or restricted? I mean, the fact that one can find more information than one could possibly want about any literary phenomenon on the internet, its reliability is another question, of course. But I think it does then place the genre, narrow the genre, the duties of the genre considerably. So that it seems to me that a literary history now needs to be an account. And in a way, this makes it somehow less dangerous to write a single author literary history, because if your literary history had to meet very strict criteria of accuracy, you would really need a team of experts who are specialists in bibliography and textology, and rather than people who are together with you on a particular ethical and theoretical plane. So I do think that the task is actually easier, quite apart from the fact that it's easier to look these things up oneself when one is writing, as we know.
And the notion of pseudo-comprehensiveness.
That's right, that's right. And the notion of, yes, that scientific claim that Welleck criticized and mocked, is no longer burdening us.
You put a lot of emphasis on the nation state, and I like the Hegelian tone that the state is the highest creation of mankind, and I don't object to that. But there are also many nations that don't have a state. And I suppose Ukraine also, like many other nations in Eastern Europe, at sometimes was very unsure about whether it was ever going to be a nation state or be one again. And then there's other nations that will never have a state of their own, whether it's the Canadian First Nations or the many nations in Russia and so on and so on. So is there a difference of writing or is there a difference in purpose of writing a national literary history if you do have a state or if you don't?
Yes, well, of course there is. I mean, when did national literary histories get going? I mean, really, in Germany in the 1820s and 30s, when Germany was not a unified state, and they were all called. I looked this up once, and I was stunned to see how many different titles they are that contain the word Nationalliteratur. People writing in Bavaria and Saxony and Anhalt-Zerbst or wherever, and invoking the German nation, which to them exists as a cultural and linguistic entity. And of course they incorporate Austria into this. And it's clear to them that what they're engaged in is a political project to further the creation of a German nation state. Now, most of the authors conceive of this at that stage as a project of liberation, but many of them evince values that we would find highly questionable. Values about, like, the purity and of the German race, and the particularity of the German spirit, which they wish, as it were, out of these ancient and more recent texts to bring out, as it were. So, of course, yes, these things are written in different ways. I think that is what Linda Hutcheon has very much in mind when she writes about, so favorably, about the post-colonial literary histories that she approves of. Now, she has in mind literary histories that are written in what are now nation states, decolonized existing nation states, which look back at the history of empire, and they do so with an awareness of and a determination to reflect the trauma of that history. And so it's a kind of literary history is telling the truth. Now, that is, I think, the situation that you are in if you are writing a literary history, for argument's sake, of one of the nations of one of the Australian Aboriginal nations, for argument's sake, or one of the Canadian native peoples, or the Yakuts. I'm sure there is a history of Yakut literature. But obviously, our readiness to how shall I phrase this? Our readiness to sympathize with the libertarian or self-assertive dreams of the subaltern is different from the desire of established, powerful nations to write triumphalist stories about themselves. So I think we all now retrospectively look at, Gervinus and Koberstein and these early German historians, and we see terrible ghosts lurking among the lines there. But one would forgive, and I not just forgive, but understand. The Estonian writer whom I quoted, who has this assertive, if you like, view of the national identity in general, but you can see that it's the Estonian national identity projected as a kind of a project to be protected at all costs. You can understand that it has a different status, morally speaking, it seems to me, than the kind of triumphalist national literature, the literary histories written from an imperial perspective. I mean, the British histories are like this as well.
French, British,
yes. The kind of the self-congratulation, the kind of the being at ease in the world.
The unique poetic genius of me.
Yeah, exactly.
What about the Welsh?
Could we take the next several burning questions to the other room over a glass of bubbly and coffee, or a cup of coffee, please? Thank you so very much, Marko. That's a wonderful note.